With many of his works from the late 1950s to the 80s obliterating the moulds of the biopic, the literary adaptation and the rock opera, whilst delivering fresh and inventive stabs at gothic horror, erotic thriller and science fiction extravaganza, why is it that Russell's career seemed to shrink away from the 80s onwards? It's a complex question that I couldn't begin to answer with 100% certainty myself, but it would seem that even his contemporaries struggled somewhat in the 90s to get all their projects off the ground. With the possible exception of 1990's adaptation of Roald Dahl's The Witches, Nicholas Roeg is certainly not remembered for any of his 90s commissions, despite blazing a trail of evocative and superbly edited masterpieces in the 70s and 80s, which includes Walkabout, Don't Look Now, Bad Timing and The Man Who Fell to Earth. Peter Watkins, who also started off by making controversial works for the BBC alongside Russell with its extremely inventive mockumentary style of filmmaking, with works like Culloden and his masterwork The War Game, a film so controversial that it got banned by Parliament before it even aired. He continued making brilliant films like Privilege, Gladiators, Punishment Park and Edvard Munch, but pretty much always got funded by other countries from the 70s onwards. The directors who did continue to, and still continue to remain prevalent, are directors like Ken Loach and Mike Leigh, whose work is of course excellent, but much more in line with kitchen sink realism and slice of life, the very thing that Russell's cinema was not. The only two other prominent British directors who did continue to build their filmography in Britain through the 80s and 90s, and whose work is not of the kitchen sink ilk, are Peter Greenaway and Derek Jarman. In both cases I would say that it's because their films are much more avant-garde than the work of Russell and Roeg. Particularly Jarman, who, had he not died in early 94, surely would have continued to be at the forefront of the British queer cinema movement for the rest of the decade. Greenaway's films had the combination of appealing to the art house critics and avant-garde circles whilst also tickling the fancies of cult film fans due to their promises of fleshy vulgarity, unhinged violence, cannibalism and other taboos in films like A Z and Two Noughts and The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover. Despite occasionally being talked about in the same breath as Russell, due to their abilities to shock audiences and critics alike, Russell was not a fan of Greenaway, at least not at the time of writing his 1993 book Fire Over England, where he describes watching Greenaway's direction of Brian Pringle's performance as a naked drunk in Drowning by Numbers. What is it about Greenaway's films that makes the flesh crawl? I think it's his apparent loathing of the human race. He goes on to talk about how the composer Michael Nyman said that he would supply Greenaway with reams of music that wasn't necessarily composed for any specific scene. Greenaway cuts it in arbitrary chunks according to his needs. It seems to me that he treats the human race in much the same way, and he is more interested in shit than soul. It's true that Greenaway's work doesn't have the most optimistic view of humanity, and his reasons for cattle-prodding his audience seem to be for very different intentions than Russell's use of shock tactics. 1980's Altered States was, for all intents and purposes, Russell's last big-budget moment in mainstream cinematic culture. After the film, he was purportedly offered 3 more sci-fi films, but turned them down due to fears of being typecast in the genre. One of these, I believe, was Disney's The Black Hole, which would have given David Lynch's The Straight Story a run for its money as the strangest Disney production and director combination. And I heard a rumour somewhere that another was apparently Species. Species came out in 1995 and features a H.R. Giger-designed female alien that, as Michael Madsen puts it, wants to fuck the human race into extinction. I have a soft spot for Species as I saw it when I was an impressionable 11-year-old sci-fi and horror junkie, but the thought of a version of this film that keeps Giger on board, is directed by Russell, and has a tone closer to something like The Lair of the White Worm, and potentially set in England, would certainly have been a trip. I'm unsure what the other could have been, but according to Russell's son Alex in the supplemental material for the BFI's recent release of The Music Lovers on Blu-ray, Russell was apparently in talks to work with Spielberg at one point. Whilst these would have all undoubtedly been bigger films than Russell ended up making in the latter phases of his career, it's debatable how much creative freedom or control he had been allowed within the big studio systems of the 80s and 90s. Whilst they may be much smaller in scale from his 70s heyday, the late 80s films and television work of Russell's are just as remarkably inventive and fun. With Whore being the director's last theatrically released feature in 1991, he only ever got backing and offers for smaller made-for-TV and direct-to-video works. Attempts that were made by Russell to hone in on and choose subjects for television that would strike a chord with audiences and hark back to his past successes, like adding Lady Chatterley to his D.H. Lawrence adaptation catalogue and biographising more composers, including a revisit to his most popular subject Elgar for the 40th anniversary of his 1962 BBC masterwork, this time for their rivals at ITV. Despite being appreciated by the fans, these never did much to bolster the director back to the silver screen. Instead, they led to some much more unlikely TV movies and straight-to-video works that may be on the lower end of the Russell tier, but are still worth looking at in this odyssey through the director's work. 1991's Prisoner of Honor, made for HBO, teaches us that when you hire Ken Russell to direct your film, the worst thing that you can do is take it away from him at the editing stage. This account of the Dreyfus Affair is the most Russell-like subject of these 90s TV movie works, and has the makings of a really interesting film about religious persecution, scapegoating and political corruption, would certainly be in fine hands with the director of The Devils, due to the crossover of both films' themes. Speaking of The Devils, it even features Oliver Reed working again with Russell for the final time, alongside Brian Blessed in supporting roles for Richard Dreyfuss's lead character. The main problem with the film, though, is that it's hampered by bland editing decisions, boring music choices, and some pretty cheesy uses of slow motion that really makes the whole thing feel far too much like an average TV movie, with far too many scenes of people talking. Dreyfuss was reportedly very difficult to work with, being very insistent on specific camera angles and infamously denying Russell any editorial input in the finished picture. There are still fingerprints of Russell's here and there, but it clearly had the potential to be far better. Still though, having Oliver Reed back in a Russell film after a long absence is nice to see, and his scenes are undoubtedly the most engaging. The moments with Brian Blessed giving it his all are also rather joyous to watch.
Is it? You want us dragged through the mud?
Leave it to your superiors. No more letters. Your responsibility is to the army.
Your senior officers, sir!
1998's Dog Boys, however, is about as far away from a traditional Russell subject as one can get. It was the result of Russell being hired to direct a made-for-TV feature before being given constant anonymous memos for changes to purportedly make the film not seem too much like a Ken Russell film. So he proceeded to make the most un-Ken Russell film he possibly could, stating that, "I wanted to prove that I could make something less than art." Which, to be fair, is the best excuse I've ever heard for a director making a film of this type. I watched it again for the first time in over a decade, expecting to hate it as much as when I first watched it. But, you know what? It's really not all that bad. It's quite amusing as a knowingly schlocky prison thriller, and you could have some fun watching with a friend, laughing at the intentional cliches and taking shots every time Dog Boys, Dog Tired, or any other time dog is used in conjunction with another word.
Okay, strip search. Into the washroom. Stark bollock naked.
Don't be embarrassed, boys. Y'all been jerking them together anyway. Mo!
In between these is his 1995 adaptation of Treasure Island for Channel 4's Christmas evening slot. It's a sometimes charming but largely limp affair with a bad script and pretty hokey acting. But it does feature this pretty amusing 90s rap number though, so its existence is mostly justified.
Bath time, boys. Yo-ho, a scrubbing we must go.
Yo-ho, a scrubbing we must go.
What shall we do with this dirty old sailing?
Long Jane, you're our leader.
What shall we do with this grubby old sailing?
Long Jane, lead us to the treasure.
Rub-a-dub-dub if you want the job. If you want to join the club, put your body in the tub. You're gonna have to scrub it in the tub, cause we're off to Treasure Island. Hit it!
Rub-a-dub-dub, yes, we want the job. Yes, we want to join the club, put your body in the tub. We're gonna have to scrub it in the tub, cause we're off to Treasure Island.
I am Scrumpy.
I am Itchy.
I am Speedy.
I am Humpy, very jumpy.
And he likes his rumpy pumpy.
They are dirty, they are smelly, but they are my crew.
Ha!
And then there's 1996's Mindbender, a Uri Geller vanity project that is by and far one of the most baffling films in Russell's career. Even though it's quite clearly a winner for the worst film he's made, it's still weirdly watchable as an utterly bizarre curiosity. Some set pieces near the beginning are quite surreal, the editing in some scenes is quite experimental, and the acting combined with the horrendous dialogue that is delivered in such a stilted way could almost get away with calling itself Lynchian. How Terence Stamp managed to play the whole thing straight-faced is pretty impressive. There's also a couple of references to altered states to be found for the keenly observant viewers.
For years I wanted to research a hallucinogenic mushroom used by the Hinchi Indians in their religious ceremonies. Now may be the perfect time to do a little field work.
You need any porters?
Sorry, Eric, we're travelling light.
Whilst I've talked about Russell's inclusions to 2 portmanteau films, Aria and Trapped Ashes, in previous videos, there are 2 other slightly lesser known portmanteau works that are rarely mentioned. For a segment in the 1990 film Women and Men, Stories of Seduction, Russell would adapt Dorothy Parker's Dust Before Fireworks, featuring RoboCop and Naked Lunch star Peter Weller alongside Molly Ringwald. It's a very stagey affair and quite a frustrating watch for me, as I found both the source material annoying as well as Molly Ringwald's delivery. It makes up for some of its shortcomings though, via its slick 1920s aesthetic and well as fantastically dry reactionary presence to Ringwald's insufferable monologues.
I've got a stitch of jealousy in me. Jealous. Good heavens, if I was going to be jealous, I'd be about someone worthwhile and not some silly, stupid, idle, worthless, hysterical, promiscuous, sex-ridden.
Darling.
I'm sorry. I guess I'm sorry. Maybe the way they behave isn't really their fault. After all, they'll never know how lovely it is when we're alone together. Oh, it is, Hobie, isn't it? Isn't it?
Uh-huh.
In the mid-1990s, Russell directed another short film entitled The Insatiable Mrs. Kirsch, for the tantalizingly titled Tales of Erotica anthology film. It was generally panned along with the rest of the film for being very unerotic. I kind of liked that about the short though. I haven't seen it in context with the rest of Tales of Erotica, but I like the idea of a man becoming obsessed with a woman whom he believes must be constantly horny and imagines the naughtiest things when he hears the buzzing sounds coming from a hotel room in the middle of the day, before discovering the unsexy revelation of what those sounds actually are when he is invited up. It's a fun subversion of the tropes for a kinky short story that essentially calls the man out as the pervert and wags its finger at the audience for their lusty expectations. Even if he would rarely get a commissioned project with any sort of budget again after the 90s, Russell would at least take back full creative control with his Gorsewood home video films of the noughties. They're not talked about as much again due largely to their unavailability to watch, since the only one to have had a physical release was his feature-length spin on Edgar Allan Poe titled The Fall of the House of Usher, which I've talked about in a previous video. I've always found it best watched in small doses, and I believe that the original release intention for this was for it to be released as several shorter episodes on the internet, something that Russell was, again, way too ahead of his time for. There are shades of tongue-in-cheek fun that almost hark back to the spirit of White Worm at times. Snippets of his first Gorsewood short, The Lion's Mouth, can also be seen on the 2001 South Bank Show special on Ken Russell's career, which in itself is a fascinating interview where the director talks at length with Melvin Bragg about the industry that left him behind and why he decided to go back to amateur guerrilla filmmaking. His 2007 short, A Kitten for Hitler, was famously born out of a bet with Melvin Bragg 10 years prior to come up with a script for a film that would instantly get banned. Russell quickly wrote a treatment for a tale about a little Jewish boy who wants to warm Hitler's icy cold heart by bringing him a kitten for Christmas. The plan initially works until Hitler finds out that the boy is Jewish and decides to make a lamp out of his flesh. No one batted an eyelid in 2007, but make this today and you'd probably get cancelled and blacklisted by the industry. The only others that I even have the vaguest impressions of are from a video that someone uploaded onto YouTube recorded at a rare screening of a couple shorts. Those were The Good Ship Venus, which is a collection of sea shanties sung by some horny sailors backed up by some quirky visuals. It's part of the director's Hot Pants trilogy, along with the intriguingly titled The Revenge of the Elephant Man and The Mystery of Matahari. The other was a rough cut of a section of Boudica Bites Back, Russell's final completed work, that takes the form of a mini-filmic opera, shot entirely on green screen, whose imagery of rapey Roman soldiers also harks back to the Lair of the White Worm's hypnotic hallucination sequences. Whilst all of these works are of an entirely different vein to the cinematic masterworks and groundbreaking television documentaries of the 70s, they clearly show Russell's determination to keep on creating to the very end, no matter the budget and restrictions, which is one of the most inspiring lessons that any young aspiring filmmaker should take heed of. If you don't have the budget to achieve your vision, do it anyway. Sometimes it's your passion and creativity that shines through and leaves the biggest impression on the viewer. Russell carried on no matter the odds or the medium. Outside of cinema and television, he directed adverts, music videos, operas, a radio play, and wrote several novels. He lectured at Southampton University and even entered the celebrity Big Brother house. He also had a brief stint in acting, appearing alongside Sean Connery in The Russia House, and a cameo in a great underrated mockumentary called Brothers of the Head. Roger Daltrey's last recollection of talking to Russell was when he phoned him up asking him to play the Mad Hatter in a version of Alice in Wonderland that he was working on to the very moment of his passing in 2011. The industry may have cruelly left directors like Russell behind in the 90s, leading them to director-for-hire work like Dog Boys and Mindbender, but the next generation of filmmakers that grew up in his heyday are proving now that the idiosyncratic creativity of Russell, Rogue and Jarman that shook up the British film industry with has been reborn again. Cornish director Mark Jenkin is easily one of the most interesting recent talents to have gained recognition. His unique film style with Bate and Ennis Main may draw more from the well of Nicholas Roeg and Derek Jarman, but the use of a classical medium to tell a modern story is something that is very Russell-like in its silent film-esque approach to storytelling. Peter Strickland is certainly the modern king of sound design and music in British film, with Barbarian Sound Studio, the Duke of Burgundy and the delightfully weird Flux Gourmet, effortlessly igniting the sensorial brilliance of imagery paired with the right sounds. Then there's also Ben Wheatley, who has proved to be something of a jack of all trades with his broad range of subjects and genres. A Field in England in particular felt to me like something of a love letter to films like The Devils and Altered States. One could carry on and on about the many aspects and areas of Ken Russell's work, but I'd like to finish this video by briefly mentioning some of the most important collaborators, whom I've yet to properly talk about. Something that makes Russell's work click together so well is the collaboration of talents to create these unified visions. Be it the acting talents of frequent players like Oliver Reed, Glenda Jackson, Georgina Hale, Murray Melvin, Roger Daltrey, Christopher Gable, Max Adrian or Amanda Donohoe, to the costume work of Shirley Russell, the frequent collaborations with editor Mike Bradsell, or the camera work of Dick Bush. There's obviously Hugh Weldon's importance in his BBC days, Dan Ireland for giving him his 80s renaissance, and Melvin Bragg, who's been a prominent collaborator for most of his career. And last but not least, his wife Lizzie, who undoubtedly was his muse and most prominent collaborator throughout the Gorswood years, and someone whose stories, insights and anecdotes are constantly keeping the spirit of Ken Russell alive and kicking in the public's consciousness. On that note, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video series, then please do leave a like and consider subscribing. Drop a comment below if you'd like to see me do more videos like this on other directors. Apologies for the delay in getting this final part up. I decided to take a break from YouTube videos for a bit to focus my attentions on a short film that I've been trying to finish for a while now. It's a bit of a Lynchian affair, but it's got more than a hint of Altered States to it though. I'd be happy to share it on here when it's finished for anyone that's interested. My next video on here is going to be a two-part look at the films of my second favourite British auteur, Pete Walker, which I hope to have up in a couple of weeks.
Please! I was put on this earth to combat sin, and I shall use every available means to do so.